This month, Revol Press joins The Portal for 4 sessions exploring Gothic capitalism and its beyond. Mike Watson will be focusing on his book Hungry Ghosts in the Machine for an event centering addiction and digital capitalism. Bram Gieben will be focusing on his book The Darkest Timeline for an event centering the collapse of the future and the apocalypse of the social. And Adam Turl will be focusing on his work Gothic Capitalism for an overall thematic of the month. To join us, you can find more information on Revol Press, or you can become a member of the portal. Links are in the description. The next Philosophy Portal course will focus on the works of early Marx. The course starts June 9th. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below or visit philosophyportal.online. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with 3 guests, all friends of the channel: Mike Watson, Bram Gieben, and Adam Turl. If you've been following the channel, I've had conversations with each of these gentlemen focused on their books published through Revol Press, focused on Mike Watson's Hungry Ghosts in the Machine, Bram Gieben's The Darkest Timeline, as well as Adam Turl's Gothic Capitalism. And in this conversation, we're going to be previewing our month in the portal coming up this June on a theme titled Gothic Capitalism and the Beyond. And this entire month will feature an in-depth analysis of all their books and how they interrelate with the collective publishing house Revol Press. So maybe just to start, Mike, I'll ask you, going with this topic, Gothic Capitalism and Beyond, of course, it's a explicit nod to Adam Turl's recently published book, but how are you thinking about this framing, and what do you hope for the month?
Hey, hi. Okay, thanks for having us, and thanks for having us for this event, which I think will be a really interesting time to kind of to delve into some of the thematics of our books and the direction of the press, which is actually a press founded by myself and which now involves Bram as co-editor. And I mean, we're broadly a left-wing critical theory press, but we have kind of other focuses. Particularly, we intend on developing relationships with the authors that are maybe a little bit more personalized than the relationships you may have with a bigger press, allowing for a deeper editing experience, which hopefully benefits the book and the author. In terms of what we're dealing with, it so happens that we have 3 initial books. First, it was Bram's, published last June, mine published last autumn, and Adam's published it was the end of last month, wasn't it? Or it was May. Was it May the 2nd? Your book came out, yeah, May the 2nd. So I mean, I say it just so happens. I mean, I guess it's not actually a huge coincidence, but we have 3 books that deal with the collapse of capitalism, the difficulties of existing in a digital capitalist society, which I tend to refer literally as a digital capitalist society, and Adam calls a Gothic capitalist society. And Bram, I think you're very much influenced by Mark Fisher. I'm not sure what term you use, but I think you refer to capitalist realism in your book, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Fisher was a huge kind of milestone in what I was writing, and I think like the good thing about these 3 books is they all deal with the dystopian aspects of the present. They look at the fact that we've seen a lot of cultural collapse, we've seen a lot of infrastructural collapse in some countries, and now we're witnessing a lot of political collapse. Certainly in the 12 months or so since my book came out. So yeah, it's interesting to revisit some of these themes. You know what it's like when you're writing a book. At a certain point, you have to sort of draw a line, and you can't keep rewriting it or adding new things. So it's very interesting to return to these themes a little bit later on and see how they've changed.
Yeah, and on that note, actually, I think it's worth saying we nearly called this event, I think we nearly called it Capitalist Realism and Beyond. So after Fisher's Capitalist Realism, but my only kind of feeling there was that we were tying it too much to one person's theory. But in a way, there's a feeling that Capitalist Realism got us so far and was such a book of the moment from when it was released in, it was either 2008 or 2009. and it influenced so many people. But now we're in a slightly different moment. I know Adam's deeply influenced by Mark Fisher, but of course Mark Fisher, he can't have fully covered the unfolding dynamics of the 2020s because he left us in 2017. So we're dealing with a Trumpian era, a post-truth era. We're dealing with AI and all the implications of AI. We're dealing with a greatly expedited social media environment. And for me, these are things that, particularly the digital aspects, are things that fuel an existing tendency towards addiction within capitalism. So we have a kind of addiction to trying to get over our innate fear of reality, of nature of the world as it is, and we try and kind of get over this fear through drugs, through relationships, and obviously through scrolling social media and digital capitalism. Really kind of it attaches itself to our innate tendency towards addiction, and is a very dangerous thing. So that's kind of my main angle, and I think capitalist realism was brilliant in identifying the issue of capitalism causing depression. But of course, it's not only depression. There are so many mental illnesses other than depression that are caused by or exacerbated by digital capitalism, by capitalism first, and then this new digital aspect. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm covering, and I think really Bram and Adam are covering similar themes. Adam's Gothic capitalism is really like is about a futuristic world that is also in ruins. Okay, and Adam can tell you more about that.
Well, I think it would be good first before going to Bram specifically. When we say Gothic capitalism and beyond, what does beyond signify for you, Mike?
Okay, well, yeah, I'll carry on there actually then. So Gothic capitalism for Adam is a kind of advanced society that's also in ruins. Of course, how much is in ruins depends really where you're standing and how much money you have. So Adam talks about combined and uneven development. Is it the other way around, uneven and combined development? It basically means that development is not equal for everybody. So we have this situation where you have slums in some areas and you have, well, I mean, when I say slums, of course, I'm not particularly talking about the Western world, although you could argue that you have slums in some parts of the Western world. But you actually could have a situation where you have slums and advanced digital technology within the slums, even because this whole notion of like, oh, people say they're poor, but I saw them with a smartphone. If I see immigrants with smartphones, I mean, this is not unusual. You could be an immigrant with no money, but you have to have a smartphone to try and get a job, to process your application for asylum, etc. So you have a situation where you have nothing, but at the same time you have this very advanced technology, or you have this other situation where you have very wealthy people living streets away or adjacent to very poor people. When I talk about what might be beyond Gothic capitalism, I suppose even when we're dealing with reality and critical theorists, that their primary role is to deal with the real and to try and interpret this so that we can one day maybe change it. And the school I come from, I mean, which is literally is the beginnings of critical theory. So the Frankfurt School, where you're talking about Adorno, Benjamin, Marcuse, to varying degrees, were really reluctant to present a way out. So the whole purpose, especially for Adorno, but you see this a lot in Benjamin. Marcuse is a little bit different, but they're very reluctant to present a way out because presenting a way out is what got us in trouble in the first place. So these kind of false utopias or projected utopias, messianic projections, actually resulted in conflict and the horrors of World War II, etc., in the modernist period. So Adorno particularly is very reluctant to give any solutions, and his view is that a philosopher's task is to describe our situation, and then describing our situation and living through it. You hope that the dialectic of different forces interacting might eventually kind of stick onto something. You might eventually get some traction with some kind of concept or movement which actually changes something. And actually, Mark Fisher says a very similar thing right at the end of Capitalist Realism. I forget the line actually; it's on the last page, I think. Has anyone got Capitalist Realism with them? It basically says that there can emerge, or there can occur, small tears in the fabric of reality, small, what he calls fissures. So basically small tears through which, light can appear or hope can appear. And he very much says, if you follow the 2 pages before that whole passage says that this may emerge from the creativity of basically mentally ill people. So it's almost like capitalism makes you mentally ill, but the mental illness might reveal truths that you wouldn't otherwise be able to reveal, and they may possibly gain traction so as to change reality. So change is possible, but we have to start out from the problems, not from just like some kind of fantastical solution which can lead to all kinds of disasters. So the beyond Gothic capitalism, which could also be beyond digital capitalism, is the hope there will be something beyond. But I certainly don't particularly point to it in my book. And Bram basically says we're completely screwed, but maybe it's time to start archiving our greatest achievements. In case anyone survives this and might find solace from some of the artworks we've made or something. And Adam's not a whole lot more positive. I think he just says that the working class may be the only way forward, and perhaps out of some kind of outsider art, which I guess also would be produced often by mentally ill people, something may emerge. But I don't think Adam even gives us that much. Adam can explain later. But the beyond is not really a hope. It's more the work we do now to deal with reality may birth a beyond. That's all. But we can't. I don't think we can imagine what it would be.
Well, I see
I think
I
that
see the portal as the midwife of the concept. So we're hopefully getting into that birthing process. But like you say, we gotta start with the problems, and that's one of the things I appreciated about all your work. But maybe Bram, in you particular, in the darkest timeline, sort of really challenging us to look at the darkness of the present in order to potentially birth something new. And the way you explored a lot of your themes in the darkest timeline, I think, are also methodologically important in regards to how you're using fiction, how you're engaging with science fiction creatively to think some of the more negative aspects of digital capitalism or capitalist realism. Is there anything you'd like to say about either the framing of Gothic capitalism and the beyond and how you're approaching this month?
So I think, to go back to what Mike's saying, I think perhaps we're more interested in theorizing currents of resistance than we are in imagining utopias. That's maybe the thing that's like the full start in the word beyond, maybe. I think we'd all like to move beyond Gothic capitalism, which is, as Mike's described in Adam's book, is kind of capitalism in ruins. But I think we're still living through it. I'd take it back to a quotation that I used at the start of my book from William Gibson. He says, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And I think that's a really interesting way of describing the inequality that we can see all around us, even if we live in a fairly kind of privileged level of that, whereby our immediate surrounds seem calm, everything's normal, we're going to work, but we're constantly assailed by images of cultures, cities, populations in collapse or being victimized. So my book was an attempt to kind of think through those comfortable positions and what underlines them, what allows us to live outside of the collapse that's happening and be blind to it. I think it's interesting to go back to Fisher now, because as Mike says, his ideas and his writing have survived into the 2020s, but he himself wasn't able to witness it. And I do really wonder what he would make of some of the currents that we're seeing dominate right now. I think one of the most surprising things for me in the last year has been the centrality of things like effective accelerationism to, in particular, the Trump movement. It's a kind of form of techno-utopianism. Mark Andreessen, who's a Trump advisor, wrote a techno-optimist manifesto. And in that, he quoted Nick Land. And it's really interesting to think about the way he's using the ideas of Nick Land there, because he's kind of mistaken them for some sort of optimistic, place that we could reach where technology meets all our needs. Whereas Land's accelerationism was extremely negative. It was a driving towards collapse, a driving towards apocalypse in order to get through it. So I think, perhaps Andreessen skipped the part where the world collapses and is hoping that we can drive beyond that. But then if you look at, again, some of the, Silicon Valley ideologues and billionaires that have been so closely involved in our discourse and our politics in the last 12 months, there's almost a level of reality denial going on there as well. This idea that you could use the same approach that you took to taking over Twitter and apply it to American government, just fire everybody, and if it breaks, hire them back. These are some of the things I've been looking at, and it's very interesting as well just to see certain fringe figures drawn into that political discourse as well, like Curtis Yarvin. He's been an advocate for things like networked states, whereby you have a corporate controlled state with a kind of political figurehead, but really it's controlled by a corporation. And in his writings, he very much proposes that you would only be able to live in a networked state if you were contributing economically, that, to be a non-contributor would mark you as somebody to be kicked out and kept outside the borders of that state. So, he's describing a situation where vast swathes of people would be considered surplus, So I think we're starting to see the teeth now behind techno-optimism, behind Silicon Valley ideologies. Just before we kicked off the podcast, we were talking about the kind of suppression of left-wing ideas, voices, and thinkers that's happened algorithmically since this rightward shift. And I think, trends like that for me are the ones that perhaps I didn't get in front of in time to include them in my book, but very much look forward to kind of discussing a few of these, looking at a few slides and thinking about kind of what might happen. I think there's a growing number of people who are very skeptical, particularly about artificial intelligence and the ways in which that might undermine our critical thinking, our ability to produce art. So I think I've seen, if you like, the green shoots of backlash against techno-utopianism. And I'm not sure if that points to a beyond yet, but it certainly seems inspiring. And actually, maybe that neatly takes us into discussing some of Adam's work as well, in that what I liked about Adam's book was it found hope in the art community, particularly with the emphasis on community. And I think that's something I was trying to drive out with my talk about archival, in that surviving any kind of collapse will involve holding on to what we love and trying to, make sure that it survives that collapse. I like the idea in Adam's book that we can trust some of that to the artists, to the curators, as well as to writers and thinkers,
What's coming out of that for me in regards to what you're emphasizing in our current political environment is that there is an all new kind of assault on workers without questioning new social policies that can actually help us accommodate new modes of industrial production. It's like there are these new modes of industrial production, and if you can't keep up, then you're basically this surplus, this excess, where the threat is that most of humanity is going to become this surplus or this excess. And what do we do in that type of situation? It seems like it's only at the beginning of the conversation of how this dynamic's unfolding. I think in the next 3 years, we're going to see if we're just starting to see the teeth, maybe we're going to see the full bite.
Yeah, quite possibly. One of the scariest things that I read recently was from Elon Musk talking about his humanoid robots. And he was saying he envisions a future where there are literally billions, tens of billions of humanoid robots doing many of the tasks that we now associate as manual labor, or care work, or any number of things. And somebody, I can't remember who it was, pointed out that one of the things that the mythology of capitalism has had to sustain it is all of its illusions and myths are designed from preventing us realizing that there's more of us than there are of them. There are more poor alienated laborers than there are rich techno-capitalists. What happens, though, when that isn't the case? What happens when the robots of the techno-optimist, techno-capitalists actually outnumber the human beings? I mean, that could be a very dangerous future for us to imagine. So yeah, I think you're right that this is just the beginning of some of these malign trends, and hopefully our job as thinkers and writers is to find the reaction to that.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions
I
there,
think
not particularly for Bram, but in general. Um, just how are they going to produce that many robots out of what? Resource-wise, a lot of what's projected, it just seems impossible. Also, when you bear in mind how much energy is required just to make a short video with AI. So I think development's gonna hit a brick wall at some point. Yeah, that's just one observation. But I do agree that there's an issue of having a surplus labor force, but effectively it wouldn't be a surplus labor force. It would be just a huge unemployed and unemployable population, and that's never really gone well, And I wonder, would they just be used for vanity building projects, for example? Because it will be difficult to produce enough robots to build infrastructure. So maybe it's more the case that humans will end up basically becoming slaves, building like pyramid style projects. I mean, we have seen this, not that exactly, but we have seen maybe a glimpse of what's to come. Although I think it's extremely kind of poorly envisaged and planned. But the idea that tariffs should lead to iPhones being made in America, and is it this guy Witkoff in the American government? What's his role in government? Stephen Witkoff. He has some role in Trump's government, and basically he often appears on TV saying ludicrous things. But he said, well, all of those tiny screws getting screwed into the computers, well, that's what we're bringing back here. That's what we're bringing back to America. So on the one hand, they're getting rid of all of these civil servants who deal with admin-style jobs. And on the other hand, they're saying, let's impose tariffs so we get the manufacturing jobs back. So if you think about it, it doesn't take much of a leap to imagine that they want to repurpose us from being administrators. Actually, Bram is a civil servant, being teachers like me and Adam, to making electrical components. So yeah, that's maybe the future that awaits, but good luck with that, because people aren't going to have it. People don't want that. So I think in any case, we end up at some point we end up with we're going to end up with a big confrontation. Sorry, Adam.
Oh, it could be even darker than that. I mean, one of the things you said was have robots build infrastructure. We have tons of robots already, and what they largely do is destroy infrastructure and human beings and, children in Gaza and so on. I'm not sure that when you look at like the Dark Enlightenment stuff and the Arvin stuff, on the one hand, it reacts to something real, which was, what now it might be called the Radical Center, Macron, the Democratic Party of the U.S., the functionaries of Starmer and so on. Historically tying the idea of the Enlightenment to neoliberalism and the idea that this was the rational way society was organized, and that failed to a large number of people. But there's a logic of exterminism, I think, that lies behind a lot of this stuff. The tariffs, obviously, because you need an industrial policy, not just tariffs, to rebuild factories in Ohio. There is no industrial policy. I don't think that's necessarily the end game, or even a mid game. I think it's a pretense for some other process that's going on. And I think it's very difficult to historicize some of this stuff while it's happening. The art theorist Claire Bishop talks about this and trying to historicize. There's too many things that seem to be happening all at once to like contextualize quickly the developments that are happening, and you end up with this almost like the Borges story about the society that creates a map that is so perfect it's the same size as the country that it's a map of, that Baudrillard talked about in one of his books, and it of course annoyed all the farmers because the map was destroying their farmland and all that stuff. I think about Frederick Jameson trying to map the political unconsciousness. The political consciousness is so complex, vast, and contradictory because of the nature of contemporary media and culture. It's hard to like pin it all down. And I think one of the things that can cut against that and this feeling of hopelessness in the ruin is a sense of like trusting other people to figure out the parts of the map you can't figure out, which gets to the things like a sense of mutualism, solidarity, community, a sense of like what I talk about in my book is differentiated totality. There is a totality. It's just that we need thousands and millions of people to understand the complexities of its movement. And that points again towards some kind of collective mutual project to cut against this growing extremism in addition to capitalist realism that preceded it, right? One of the things we talked about before is like the negative space around capitalist realism not getting answered by the left, but getting answered by the right in things like Trumpism, Brexit,
Well, I guess to build on that, what Bram's already pointed towards, Adam, is that your project is really, out of the three of your projects, kind of identifying this, let's say, positive space in the artistic community. Have you seen any of that on the ground of a sort of emergent collective mapping that's coming out of art projects, art communities, and that type of thing?
It's definitely something my partner and I are involved in. Most of us for the artist Anupam Roy in India is involved in. But I think importantly, and this is something Anupam Roy does, and we do, is try to connect that artwork, the processes the artwork is involved in imagining against capitalist realism and the growing far right to other social forces, not just making an artwork that exists in isolation on a white wall in a gallery or whatever, but making artwork in collaboration with communities that are in some kind of resistance or mutual relationship to each other. I did know like Mike Watson brought up outsider art, and I talk about outsider art, mostly critical of the concept of outsider art in the book, and mentally ill people making art. I'm mentally ill. I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety disorder when I was 19 years old, and I've been making art. But I think that it has to be in connection to things outside of just the circuit of the art world or just the circuit of other artists. It needs to be connected with communities, people that are organizing, people that are working on collective projects against things like the transphobic witch hunts that have taken over much of the United States, working on defending immigrant communities, working on defending things like our healthcare, which is about to be cut substantially. Obviously, our healthcare system in the United States is not great compared to most other industrialized countries, but they're about to cut programs for about 160 million people. They're about to put work requirements in for Medicaid, which is what you get if you're too poor to have health insurance otherwise, which means you might have cancer and have to work 40 hours a week in order to get your chemotherapy. So having our artwork in connection to that, both in terms of its content, but also in terms of its physical location and the performance of the artwork in the world, I think is really important. We see some of that with left wing. We need to see more of it, I feel like. And that's part of what my book's an argument for, that we reorient our work in that way rather than as an abstract sign that floats independently from the world, which I think is a recapitulation of bourgeois ideology.
Well, one of the models that has motivated me in building Philosophy Portal is the model of philosophy, art, and religion as a triad. So when just that's coming to mind when you're saying that this art, it has to be outside of just an art circuit that's insulated unto itself. I think that we need to build communities that are interacting with each other at the nexus of what they are not. For example, art with philosophy, or philosophy with religion, or religion with art, and the interconnection between all of those dimensions is important. I think also another model that's increasingly important to me is the model between family, community, and state, and the relationship between family and community, the relationship between community or civil society and the state, and thinking about those links. So we've got, like, let's say, the interdisciplinary grid of art, philosophy, and religion, but then you've got sort of the social structural grid of thinking on the level of families, communities, and state. Is there anything there, maybe I'll start with you, Mike, that is alive for you in the Revol Press project of bringing together different aspects of philosophy and art, philosophy and aesthetics, maybe the theological dimension as well, with also thinking about the social substance, familial, communal, and how they can be sites of community, sites of resistance in a way?
Yes, yeah. Certainly, Revol Press aims at commissioning books on psychology, on spirit very broadly. I mean, to make it simple, I would say in the Hegelian sense, but I say in the Hegelian sense because I mean not in the kind of like crystal healing sense, not in the kind of new age YouTube spiritualist sense, but certainly we're very interested in thinking about the non-material or that whole category of experiences that ties in with the human need to create narratives that I would say actually the left doesn't do very well, even though the left has the best, most base narrative in all of history, which is, hey, let's make the most equal society ever. That would be a brilliant narrative, but that narrative is not really allowed to come into fruition or to play itself out in the media. The narrative that we need to distribute wealth more equally, which would involve curtailing the wealth of the richest. Naturally, the people who run the media don't let that kind of grow. So you get other narratives growing up when people are under pressure. I mean, it's something very Jungian to say, but I think it's very true. You get other narratives, spiritual narratives, conspiracy narratives, which often have a racial dimension, actually. And this can be very damaging, So those narratives are encouraged to grow in these times when people are looking around going, hey, how come I haven't got enough money? Who can I blame it on? And so the narratives around social class are closed down by the media, and the narratives that grow up around race are given space. So I'm really into the idea of actually going back to Hegel, going back pre-Marx. There's all this talk of Marx materializing Hegel. Actually, if you read Marx, there's quite a lot of room for a kind of spirit within Marx, without going into it like in great detail. But there are kind of more well-known passages of his text, like the dancing table from Capital Volume 1. Basically, Marx he talks about a table dancing. I mean, he literally just means that objects have a kind of a life of their own, and we often let ourselves be led by objects. So it ends up being that the object ends up with subjective agency, and the human becomes an object instead, following this kind of subjective this object with a mind and spirit. That's just an effect of capitalism, but you can see it throughout the ages, within capitalism or not, that we give agency to non-human things, and I think we need to revisit that. We need to revisit grand narratives as the left. So yeah, I'm all up for a kind of materialist philosophy fusion with spirit, and I think aesthetics is kind of maybe the bridge there. And actually, all of this is already in Hegel and in Marx, but I think we get lost and we lose it. So it's a question of like bringing all that back for our times. So for Hegel, the kind of ultimate combination of subject and object, of human and nature, the kind of bringing together of them, that the end of conflict. it involves the artwork, it involves art, and for Marx, you can't really say that. But I think Adorno kind of comes back, and he kind of where Marx is supposed to kind of like materialize Hegel, Adorno kind of makes a dialectic of both of them, and it's never really been said. But I realized it the other day. This is going off on a whole tangent. I won't go deep into that, but I think there's really room to start looking at the dialectic as actually a dialectic, is actually a grand dialectic between spirit and material, and that's a dialectic that needs to play out now, and it is kind of playing out now in that there's a huge kind of re-emergence of spirit, but it's in like just whack job bonkers YouTube spiritualism, and it's in Christian fundamentalism and Islamic fundamentalism, and that's where it's going to go if we can't take it and kind of steer it in a healthier direction. Which actually, if you take spirit and material to be a dialectic, does not have to be some kind of wacky spiritual, it doesn't have to be spiritual in the sense that people often take it, because spirit and material are already entwined. But anyhow, these are kind of directions I'm thinking in. So I'm very much into a dialogue with spirit.
Well, I love a lot of that, and a lot of that is certainly very synergistic with the spirit of Philosophy Portal, especially this idea that a lot of what we have here philosophically is already found in Hegel and Marx, and the tension between those two. In regards to the grand narrative and the emphasis on an equal society, there's something that Chris Catrone said which stuck with me, which is that capitalist freedom is obscene, but proletarian freedom is terrifying, and that there's something about proletarian freedom, specifically creating a more equal society, that I think we're fearful of. And I think Marx himself said that the proletariat needs to become fearful of itself, fearful of its own substance, in the Critique of the Philosophy of Right, which maybe we should think about a little more. I'm not sure what you guys think about that, but whenever we say equality, we usually say it as something laden with very positivist terms, but we never really think about actually how much fear we have about that.
Well, I think maybe, yeah, maybe the proletariat, should we say yeah, okay, we can say proletariat. I don't know what we should really call the proletariat today, but okay, yeah, okay, still the working class, the poorest working segment of society. That, yeah, there is an element that is terrifying about working class freedom, precisely because it has no grounded narrative. It's not allowed to develop one, and so the narratives that to develop are actually really scary. And if we spent more time allowing the working class to develop its own narrative without being steered by a kind of nefarious ruling elite trying to lead them into basically killing each other, if we didn't have that and they were allowed to develop their own narrative, then we may end up with a kind of utopia. So yeah, I totally agree with what you say. Yeah.
Well, I guess a similar line of thought there to you, Bram, starting with you, just in terms of, Adam, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I had something on that because it's really central to an argument I make. Then art's connected to myth historically, and myths are like stories to tell us how to live in the world. And I think a lot of leftist organizations and theorists see their role as demystifying, and uncovering and exposing when people actually need mythology to move through the world. You need to have a story of yourself in order to be in the world, especially as it currently is. And I think this is related to what Mike's talking about meta. People need grand narratives. And the abandonment of grand narratives didn't get rid of them. It just ceded them to the common sense and the Gramscian sense of common sense of capitalism. And particularly if you're going to build a movement that aims for the transformation of society, people need to believe enough in a particular story of the world to be willing to sacrifice themselves. Narrow self-interest alone didn't animate people to join communist parties and try to make revolutions and so on, because there is no logical narrow self-interest that leads you to be willing to sacrifice your life, your time, your day, everything else you want to do for a movement that if you're lucky, your grandchildren will enjoy the fruits of. You need to have a story, something that animates you in your bones and in your soul, or whatever. And one of the things I like is Michel Louis' use of the theological concept of apokatastasis, the redemption of lost souls, and how he talks about Walter Benjamin applying that to the idea that the revolutionary generation redeems all previous generations of exploited and oppressed. And you can't just have a positivistic argument about emancipated heirs. You also need the rage that you have about enslaved forebears. Now, I think in terms of a vision of the future, we're limited by the inheritance of what's happened so far, right? So we're limited by the inheritance of knowing what went wrong in the Soviet Union, of revolutions that have been defeated and ended in fascist tyranny, or a small bureaucratic elite taking over, or whatever. But I think if we reconceive the goal as universal self-determination for all people, right? Not just groups of people, but individuals, that everyone has as much freedom and autonomy as the richest asshole in the world today, but without all the negative stuff. Like, what would that look like? What would stories be in a world where everyone was the author of equally important stories? Not equally unimportant stories, but equally important. Because that gets to another thing. Do we conceive of utopia or post-capitalist society or social, whatever we want to call it, as shared scarcity or shared abundance, or something we haven't even thought of yet? I think is really important. And it's hard to get at that kind of phenomenological, cultural, dialectic relationship to the material if we have a positivistic approach to politics in everyday life, right? Like, people don't walk through life experiencing things the way the vulgar economists think they do about what is in my self-interest in this decision. That's not how people make decisions. Of course, people consider their self-interest, but it's filtered through this grand arc of storytelling and culture and everything else.
Well, I think it is interesting to think about the left as traditionally demystifying versus your emphasis on the mythological dimension of the narrative. I mean, here I just like to invoke things that might be touch points for people in the larger cultural conversation, where, of course, the work of someone like Jordan Peterson is very much engaged in the process of mythology. It is about maps of meaning. It is about the psychological significance of biblical stories. But of course, all of these mythologies are invoking Old Testament or Christian mythology that is precisely obfuscating any role of a socialist mythology. And in fact, the socialist mythology is what is deemed the worst of the worst, or the enemy mythology number one. So again, it comes back to this potential fear around equality, bourgeois values, liberty, equality, fraternity, as something that we can actually build our society around and deepen and actually orient ourselves around as a social movement. On the other hand, when it comes to the Marxist social revolutionary narrative, I think there's a lot of, just frankly, let's say, disappointment that I think people in the 19th century thought that the revolution was just one generation away. Like, they didn't think it was something that was hundreds of years away, or something that would take many, many generations and they would never live to see it. I think many people thought, well, our generation's the one to do it. We're going to redeem all of history, and then, it never comes or ends up in terror. But there's a lot there, Bram, a lot circulating there. I'm sure you've got something on your mind. What's going on?
I think it's really interesting we've come back to talking about narratives. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately, and a lot of our narratives are damaged in the way that you're just describing. The narrative of revolution has been damaged by disappointment, by things not necessarily following as quickly along as people would have thought. I think as well, you can't discount the changes that digital media have wrought upon not just the the big narratives of culture, politics, and the world, but also on our own personal narratives and our own subjective relation to how we interact online. Mike's written about digital capitalism, and a lot of that is on a kind of psychological level. It's related to individuals being addicted to that feedback loop. I think communities have become addicted to those very narrow narratives as well, and it's almost as if addiction is the right metaphor there, because what's needed is rehabilitation in a way of communities, in order to enable them to create new narratives. Thinking back to something Fred Hampton said, he said, you don't fight racism with racism, you fight racism with solidarity. We've kind of forgotten lessons like that, I think, from the struggles in the 60s, in that we've moved away from solidarity to defining our own narratives. And sometimes that can be very closed off. You mentioned Jordan Peterson there. I think, what the manosphere, which I've been writing about this year a little bit, is a good example of somewhere where it's got these self-reinforcing narratives that, countering them can often lead to strengthening them in some way, because you set up on a kind of a system of opposites, of self and other. So, I think one thing that researchers looking into the manosphere have considered is perhaps trying to employ alternative narratives rather than counter narratives. So, rather than going in and explaining to people in the manosphere why their opinions are wrong or misinformed or misogynistic, going in and listening to the frustrations, the complaints that led them to that community and starting from there. And this has some analogies with de-radicalization of people on the far right as well. Often people on the in extreme neo-Nazi groups, people who have left those groups often become the most effective practitioners at de-radicalizing others who want to leave. So I think there are a lot of lessons here for us before we think about creating new grand narratives. It's not that isn't needed, because it very much is. But there also has to be some sort of rehabilitation of the narratives that have led people to very negative or very solipsistic places, fed and kind of intensified by this addiction to the performance of self on social media. So I think all of this links together. And to bring it back to where we started, in terms of thinking the beyond, first of all, you have to think about what you're going to save from the present and how you're going to save it. And that's, in a way, a more difficult question. You could come up with a new narrative and say, this is the truth, this is the way, revolution is going to come in this many years. But unless you've already reached out and built that community around that narrative, it's going to fail, because, particularly in the media landscape that we're in, we're all kind of shouting into the void. We've all got our stories to tell or to perform. So I think it's that question of how do we reach out to people and rehabilitate things a little bit? And in a way as well, you could relate that to kind of Revol's mission, in that we're not trying to be the people who come up with, strong new theories necessarily about the way the world is, or the way history is, or economics are, or even art. I think, we're doing it something that's a little bit more about interrogating what's there and then thinking through the possibilities that arise from that. So yeah, I don't know, maybe Mike's got some thoughts about that in terms of how Revol might be a little different to a standard left-wing press, and kind of what we're trying to do here.
I think like the real feeling that this needs to be done is coming from the very top. When I say the top, is a small organisation, but it's something that we're really in the thick of it ourselves. We're really going through this process as workers. Are we intellectual labourers? I don't know. I'm a university teacher, so I'm an intellectual labourer. I don't know what Bram is. You're a civil servant, I suppose. You're an intellectual labourer. I don't know. Sometimes maybe someone asks you to go and move can you go and get the photocopy paper from the cupboard, and then you become a manual labourer for a few minutes.
Professional Skyver most days.
I was going to say me too, but I won't say me too. And I can't say I'm a professional Skyver in case my colleagues are watching. Skyver for I don't know if Skyver means anything to Cadell and Adam. Does that work in American Skyver? It means someone
I've actually never heard that term before.
So
trying to avoid
somebody
doing their work. It means to skive is to do your best to avoid doing your work.
to play hooky.
To play hooky might also not work in Canada and America. I don't know. To play hooky means the same thing anyway. Let's teach the American and Canadians some English idioms whilst we're here. Okay, in any case, how are we different here? Well, I suppose we're really trying to play through that process. Yeah, I don't really have an intention of publishing any books that aren't actually by people who are really going through the process personally, creatively. Adam is an artist. Bram is an artist of sorts. You're a rapper and a poet. I actually have been involved in curating art exhibitions and have actually performed as an artist as well, effectively. So yeah, not that everyone has to be an artist, but I think people have to be involved in the dialectic, in the concrete activity of working with either materials or working with society. Which effectively, if you're an artist, you are working with society as well, hopefully. Unless you're very detached. Well, I mean, this is actually the problem of many artists is they're not actually really working with society. But let's say that the good ones are working with society. A lot of artists claim to be, but are really trying to avoid at all costs going near the people. But we're dealing with people who they're really in the thick of it, and they're working with realities. I mean, the compendium coming out, Flowers for Marx, coming out with texts from Ben Burgess, which people will be familiar with, Matt Manus, Conrad Hamilton, and Ernesto Vargas, and Daniel Tutt, providing the foreword. If you look at Ben, you look at Matt, they're involved very much in activism, lately, and very much in the fight, disregarding their activism. I mean, Adam's like deeply involved in organisation. I think even at perhaps a different level. Not that there's a competition there, but aside from the activism, even, I mean, they're writing things on a regular basis as people based in America that you have to wonder, whether that stuff could potentially be dangerous. Because making strong anti-government statements in America now could potentially be risky. So I consider these to be people who they're dealing with the reality. They're not detached academics. We're not going to be dealing with detached academics and anyone who's not deeply feeling this with their actual life. So I think that's something that's fairly important to us.
I think, if I can add to that, I think there's a sense that the solidarity that we're talking about trying to engender through the kind of work that we're producing and publishing is a solidarity, that's in direct opposition to alienation, the kind of alienation that Fisher describes in Capitalist Realism. So for me, that's quite core to what we're looking for in a Revol book. And I think it's quite core to what each of us has written about, is that on the other side of alienation, if it can be understood, is a solidarity that can be imagined. So, if there is anything beyond the ruins of Gothic capitalism, I think it has to be built from a solidarity which at the moment doesn't exist or needs some work on. It needs to be rehabilitated a little. Broadly speaking, we're all leftists, socialists of some stripe or another. And I think that's what we would like to see some sort of return of, is like a form of solidarity that moves beyond alienation. But how do we get there? I think that's the difficult work. That's what we're trying to think through in different ways and on different levels. Don't know if Adam agrees with me there.
Well, I just want to say very quickly that one of the things that I've been focused on since diving deeper into philosophy is kind of something that I see as a paradox internal to Marxism, and specifically a paradox internal to Marxism that is perhaps brought out by Lacanian psychoanalysis, and specifically the work of Zizek, which is kind of to see the need for alienation. I know McGowan's also brought that out. That might be like a theoretical distinction that's appearing internal to leftism or socialism in general. I'm not sure if that's a distinction that's relevant to highlight in regards to Revol Press, but I just thought that might be something to surface as maybe a point that we'd want to labor on and think through in the portal is how important is alienation? What's the role of alienation? Can we overcome alienation? How does that function in the history of Marxist thought, and how might that function again if we're thinking about party politics and the reconstitution of the left? But what I want to say is kind of like the central idea that I'm taking from both Mike and Bram here is your emphasis that Revol Press is really thinking of with subjects who are quote unquote in the thick of it, really being transformed themselves by the living processes. I recall from our conversation, Bram, on the Darkest Timeline, that you were saying we can easily become split subjects between the person writing in books and the person trying to survive practically in capitalism. And so I take like this emphasis to being in the thick of it, to kind of trying to think that split as a kind of unity. But I'll just send it back to you guys in regards to, there's a number of different things we could sort of end with this idea of what does it mean to be in the thick of it? What does it mean to write in the thick of it?
Yeah,
And deepen it from there.
yeah. I mean, I have to assume that most the other left presses one thinks of when you think of a left press, that they have a lot of writers who are in the thick of it too. But I suppose being such a small press, that's it is very apparent, So the writer is in the thick of it. We as editors are kind of in there with them, and it being very small and us being able to focus on each author and just give them a lot of attention, it's possible to try and bring the very best out of them. And I've certainly seen situations culturally in the art world where I've done a lot of work in the past and in publishing, where that's not always the case. That there is, this impetus towards publishing a lot. There are publishers who are working with economies of scale, so they're really just not, looking at doing the best by the author because they need to just be, churning out books at a certain rate. So that things are missed, and people are allowed to make mistakes that maybe don't go in their favor. It's very easy to write something that you later regret when it's published. Is not actually what you intended to say, and then you have people deliberately making nefarious misreadings anyway. And we have time maybe to try and steer writers into actually saying what we think they're trying to say, making suggestions, etc. And yeah, I think that helps. So I think we intend on keeping doing that. How we keep doing that, I don't know, but it's really a case partly, as was said between me and Jason from This Is Revolution, This Is Revolution podcast. One has to kind of keep themselves in check. You have to kind of ask yourself, are you still doing things in the spirit you intended to when you started? Are you being a kind of honest, decent person working according to the principles of the politics that you're espousing? And if we grow, I really hope we're able to to ask ourselves those questions. And I don't think there's an issue of me and Bram running away with things and it becoming a platform for our personalities. So that I think we're not at risk of doing that, and that we can try and stay close to our principles.
There's something
Well, I
in
think
there
that,
about slowness as well.
yep,
The tendency in digital capitalism is to move fast, to post often, to
effective
react.
acceleration.
Yeah, I think we want to approach things a little more slowly and carefully. Not to say that we aren't going to have a presence online or promote ourselves, or that we won't come on and share our personalities on a podcast. It's more that what we're trying to do is do things at a particular pace, I think, that allows for deeper reflection perhaps.
I love that. I think it's so important. I think the tension again between kind of the humanist values that many of us aspire to and the way in which that can be contradicted by industrial production, for example, having a a big publishing house, right, can really lead to huge tensions between the people who founded that publishing house, right? And we see that all the time. So one of the principles that I think has become important for me is growing at the speed of the human relationships. If we can grow at the speed of human relationships, and for me that involves the patience of the concept, that we can have patience in our thinking and patience with ourselves, and do as much as possible to cultivate that inner spiritual as well as material work, to make sure we're not being captured by, let's say, narcissistic incentives or the incentives of digital capitalism, the addiction that Mike talks about. I think that's really important, and I do see that in what you guys are doing, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this month collaborating with you guys, because I do see your guys' project. I think it's really important. I love the books you guys are releasing, and I'm excited to dive in deeper with all of you. So maybe as a final thought for each of you, maybe starting with you, Adam, since I haven't heard for you in a second, maybe just give some final thought or reflection about why someone would want to jump in for this month, what they might be looking forward to, as well as sort of a realistic look at, we're going to be diving into some pretty dark themes. We are accepting and facing a present reality that's not exactly ideal in a deep sense. But at the same time, I think we do need philosophical spaces as well as those artistic communities to bring out these tensions and build community. So yeah, maybe starting with you, Adam.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I hope we get at is there's a lot of normative assumptions even in critical spaces, and those can be contradictory or whatever. But like, for example, in academia, performing the idea that you're a detached academic, intellectual, or whatever, even if you're an adjunct who can barely afford your rent. Or I remember a professor friend of mine who was an adjunct, who pretty much thought the world was about to end, but was still trying to train people on how they could get tenure or whatever. There's an sort of there's an insidiousness to like a lot of those norms that like short circuit criticality, I feel like, as well as short circuit community. And in terms of alienation, like party politics, a lot of times political organizing reproduces the alienation of the spaces that got people wanting to organize against those things in the first place. And what I'm hoping we can do is unpack and like go through like what are the ways that we can create mutualism, solidarity, and criticality and possible alternatives, without falling prey to those assumptions, which I think is something that's good in the books that Revol Press has put out so far, like examining the debtor addict stuff that Mike did, and looking at looking straight ahead at the existential crisis that we face socially, and as human beings, because there can be a real weird detachment between like the political plan, for example, a lot of my comrades in DSA, to accumulate more votes than to like basically do Kautsky 2.0, and we'll get enough people in parliament or Congress and we'll change the direction of politics, and the absolute crises that we're in, the urgent crises about the Anthropocene, the destruction of the planet, and ongoing genocide, and finding a way at the locus of individual people as well as the social project to deal with that contradiction. How do we convince each other and ourselves to keep fighting in this context? And the facts aren't enough. We have to get to these other questions in order to get that organized, I feel like.
Awesome. Same question to you, Bram. What are you looking forward to in the portal and thinking together, and maybe something that you're hoping to get out of this process?
I think I'm really interested in seeing how mine and Adam's and Mike's presentations come together. It's always difficult when you're in the thick of things, to see how all these books fit together. But just from today's conversation, I think, we could definitely say we've assembled something from the different parts of our books. I guess in my own presentation there'll be a certain amount of "I told you so." There's definitely been some movement in the direction of apocalypse, for want of a better word, and I'd like to try and think through some of that. But as always, I'd also like to leave us an escape route of some kind as well, whatever that might be. So yeah, I'm desperately searching for some positives at the moment to bring to the presentation too, so that it's not ending on too gloomy a note. And I think some of the things we've talked about today in terms of community building, grand narratives, these are things which make me think differently about my own work. So that definitely, to me, demonstrates the value of being part of this very small community of Revol authors, and growing, hopefully growing.
Amazing. And I guess we'll end with you, Mike.
I always have a great dialogue with you anyway, Cadell, so I think it will be a great opportunity to carry on speaking. And I'm interested in this idea of the dialectic, and I know as you're very interested, maybe we can go over that when we start talking next week. The dialectic, the relationship between Hegel and Marx. Perhaps we can touch upon that, but try and do it in such a way that the reader does not need to have digested the whole of the phenomenology and capital to understand what we're saying. So we're going to try and lightly unpack it for my own benefit. So maybe taking some of these themes about capitalism and what's coming next, and relating that to dialectical movements. But generally, yeah, just for me thinking through what's it mean to believe in fundamentally defining the truth of our moment, in primarily doing that when the moment is so blocked. Where does that leave one? Because I believe that already is revolutionary as an act. But if you're defining a moment and your revelation of the truth is that we're blocked, how is that revolutionary? And I want to kind of think about what that leaves us with, because I think it's essential. But I think also that then okay, well, where are we? If we've just said we're blocked, then that's not taking us anywhere. And I want to believe that it's necessary. So I want to go through how that might help us, even if it seems very negative.
Well, everyone, this has been Cadell Last with Mike Watson, Bram, Gieben, and Adam Turl. We're going to be collaborating for a month in the portal for a month titled Gothic Capitalism and Beyond. We're going to start off with a session where I'm going to be presenting basically an overview of all three of these gentlemen's books. As I mentioned, we've discussed all three of them already on the channel, but having a chance to dive deep, see the interconnections between the three of them, like Bram was pointing towards, and also have a chance to discuss first person with Mike throughout the presentation. In the second session, we're going to be discussing addiction and digital capitalism, and Mike Watson's going to be leading that one. And then in the third session, we'll have a presentation with Bram Gieben on the collapse of the future. And then we'll be ending the month with a real talk session, which is basically a sharing circle titled What is Beyond Capitalist Realism? Or you could say, what is beyond Gothic capitalism or digital capitalism, however we want to signify or sense these things. This is just giving you a sense of what's to be expected in this mini course in the portal throughout June. So again, this has been Cadell Last with the Revol Press gang. Hope you guys join us this June in the portal, and thanks so much for watching. This month, Revol Press joins the portal for 4 sessions exploring Gothic capitalism and its beyond. Mike Watson will be focusing on his book Hungry Ghosts in the Machine for an event centering addiction and digital capitalism. Bram Gieben will be focusing on his book The Darkest Timeline for an event centering the collapse of the future and the apocalypse of the social. And Adam Turl will be focusing on his work Gothic Capitalism for an overall thematic of the month. To join us, you can find more information on Revol Press, or you can become a member of the portal. Links are in the description. The next Philosophy Portal course will focus on the works of early Marx. The course starts June 9th. To learn more or to sign up, check the link below or visit philosophyportal.online.